In the last lecture, we noted how Kierkegaard's writings arose in response to philosophers and theologians who maximized rational argumentation, but when they did that, did so by suppressing the role of human passion, in making life decisions and solving the big issues and so on. We saw it in two places there. One was in Hegel's account of the history of civilizations and the development of human thinking through the years. But we also saw it in the rational theologies and the repetitive formulas of worship in the Danish Lutheran Church. When Kierkegaard looked at those two things, Hegel, the leading philosopher, and worship in the kind of the official church there in Denmark, he saw much that was unnatural and unsuited to real human fulfilling lives. Now we took in that last class a brief look at his book, Fear and Trembling. It's that remarkable retelling of the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, in which he amplifies several different perspectives of that story that readers often never think about, never entertain. Like what did Isaac think about that whole business of being tossed on the altar and having the knife poised over him? How did Isaac feel about it? What did he think about it? And was Abraham honest with Sarah when he got ready to leave home and go off to kill their son? And how could Abraham himself come to the point of holding that knife above this much awaited and much beloved son, ready to plunge it in there, and then in the next moment change his mind? In exploring those avenues, Kierkegaard hoped to recover some real human interest for modern philosophy, because he felt like, as many people have felt, that philosophy in the modern period has moved farther and farther away from issues that are central to the lives of most people. I don't know, any of you ever lose any sleep trying to, lying awake at night wondering whether a tree that falls in the forest really makes a noise when there's nobody there to hear it? I mean, who really cares? There's a bit of cleverness there, but not much to do with real life. But who does not at some point lose sleep wondering about what's the meaning of life? What am I to do with my years? What's the answer to the question, should I marry? And how do I get an answer to that question? Whom should I marry? I mean, Kierkegaard, for a long time worried about whether it would be better to marry Regina or to throw his whole being into his writing, which was the choice he finally made. People worry about questions. Must I love God? Must I love my neighbors? Can that sort of stuff even be commanded as the result of some rationalistic account of truth and right? Or must it arise in some other way? What happens is Kierkegaard looks at modern life and discovers a whole bunch of very important questions to which there is no objective answer. No universal answer useful to everyone who worries about such questions, who asks them and puzzles over them. I mean, what is the meaning of life? Something often promised as part of every introduction to philosophy class would, in Kierkegaard's understanding, better be asked as, what's the meaning of my life? Or what's the meaning of your life? Not in some general, universal terms. For it's within my life that I must make the decisions and act on the basis of them. And if I answer those questions and if I make those decisions, and then I pretend to other people that I have used universally true standards or completely objective standards to make those decisions, then I am, Kierkegaard says, dishonest. I'm dishonest with others, and I'm dishonest with myself. In the same way, those objective answers lack passion in the sense we talked about in that last class. And this is a good point at which to ask that question again, which I said is hard to answer at the beginning, but I think is a little easier to answer now. What is the meaning of that term that we identify with Kierkegaard's thought and the thought of some others, that term existentialism? How can we say some general things about it, if we can, to describe what it is? Now, you see right away that coming up with a universal objective definition is going to go a little against the grain of Kierkegaard, and it turns out some of the others. If it's the same for everybody, which we'd like to say, could be the case if the term is consistent in its meaning, then much of what he says, calling into doubt some of the universal rational answers, would be questionable. And it does, in fact, turn out that when you look at the several people we think of as existentialists, they are remarkably different from one another in several ways. And so all we can look for are some themes that do pop up here and there among the existentialists. One of them that comes out of the etymology of the word is an excellent place to start, especially given Kierkegaard's critique of people like Hegel and his critique of rationalistic theology. The word is based upon, of course, the word existence. Now we ask ourselves, if you were not basing your thought upon real existing reality, what would you base it on? And the answer comes to us largely as a descendant from the work of Plato and to some extent Aristotle, but mainly Plato. Plato talked about forms. Eternal, unchanging ideas that are the ultimate standard by which all knowledge can be judged later. Whether it's truth, justice, or beauty, or one of the other kind of practical questions, coming up with a sense of, say, not just as he did in the Republic, what would a just state be like, but also what would a just individual be like? And for which he assumed there were some standard answers that would apply to all people, maybe even most people. I mean, to most people, maybe even all people. Then we've got a term here that carries over into the medieval thoughts, not as the word form, but as the word essence. Particularly in medieval times, the influence of Greek thought came in this way, asking what is the essence of something? And so just as Socrates said, what is justice, someone might come back and say, what is the essence of a just person? Or what is the essence of a just state? And essence there sort of refers to the rational core that all those things have in common. To some extent, it's a standard form of definition. If we ask, what is a chair? Then we have a variety of chairs in the world, and it's not easy to come up with a simple, straightforward definition of all those chairs because they vary from these contemporary little things here to the big overstuffed recliners and all kinds of things that count as chairs somewhere in the world. And you can't just say, well, it's whatever you sit upon, because we sit upon all kinds of things, and it's a trivial problem. But to some extent, coming up with the essence of something is sort of like that. What do all those things have in common? And Kierkegaard is one of those people who wants to say, that's not a very important question. It doesn't so much matter, and we put it in the adjective form, it doesn't so much matter what is essential to being such a thing. What matters is the existing thing, the existing individual person. What is your life like? What kind of choices do you make? And so we come out of this notion of looking for big, general, universal, rational answers out there somewhere, in Plato's realm of forms, or perhaps in the mind of God, and coming back and asking individuals about their lives and how they choose and how they live. And that's the point at which, because we're moving away from general rational answers, we move back toward answers in which we have some passionate connection. Socio, in his chapter, makes the same critique here that he made in the chapter on the utilitarians, that when democracy comes in and says every person counts the same, they devalue the fact that in our lives, some people count more than others. And we pretend that that's not so if we try to pretend that we all count the same. Everyone is numerically the same. Those people we love count more for us. Is that passion? Perhaps. Perhaps it's more than passion. But we certainly are not coming close to explaining how we live if all we do is to talk with Kant or Mill or Hegel or some of the others to suggest that there's no difference in how we are related to other people and how we regard them. That's perhaps is where our passion comes in. Now, once we do away with these general essences and this search for this vast universal search for truth, that leads other existentialists, not Kierkegaard, at least not in the fullest sense, but 20th century existentialists like Camus and Sartre to come up with another suggestion. That if there is no general rational answer that helps us make sense of reality, that probably means reality is absurd. That it really makes no sense. Somewhere along the way, some of you probably read some of the novels of Camus, The Stranger, for example, who wanders through life terribly disconnected. He kills someone without even thinking about it and not understanding why he might have done it. One wonders whether it's even a murder, since it happens so casually, in a way disconnected from the heart of who he is. He's a master at pointing out the ways in which people stumble through life. It's reminiscent of Kierkegaard's old critique of his fellow Europeans in those days, that most of them were going through life like a drunken peasant lying on the back of a hay cart, just kind of going where the flow of time and events takes them. Not choosing, not thinking, not intending to go anywhere in particular, but just going through life, being drug along by the tides of powers and things outside themselves. Now, it's that, of course, that leads some people to suggest that there's a good deal of absurdity in life, and all these attempts up here are missing the real point. Well, I want to read a parable or an allegory. I think I like it best as a parable out of Kierkegaard's journals that give us a sense of what he saw, you know, among his fellow citizens there in Denmark and how he responds to it. It's called The Tame Geese and subtitled A Revivalistic Meditation. This particular one's in sort of a standard anthology with selections from his attack on Christendom, his sickness unto death, a lot of his other, and either or, which we're going to be talking about next time. Suppose it was so that the geese could talk. Then they had arranged it so they could also have their religious worship, their divine service. And every Sunday they came together and one of the ganders preached. The essential content of the sermon was, what a lofty destiny the geese had, and what a high goal the Creator. And every time this word was mentioned, the geese curtsied and the ganders bowed their head. What a high goal the Creator had set before the geese. By the aid of their wings, they could fly away to distant regions, blessed climes where properly they were at home, for here in the barnyard, they were only strangers. And so it was every Sunday. And as soon as the assembly broke up, each waddled home to his own affairs, and then next Sunday again to divine worship, and then again home. And that was the end of it. They throve and were well-liking and became plump and delicate, and then were eaten on Martinmas Eve, and that was the end of it. That was the end of it, for though the discourse sounded so lofty on Sunday, the geese on Monday were ready to recount to one another what befell a goose who wanted to make serious use of the wings the Creator had given him, designed for the high goal that was proposed to him. What befell such a goose? What a terrible death he encountered. And this the geese could talk about knowingly among themselves. But naturally, to speak about it on Sundays was unseemly. For, said they, it would then become evident that our divine worship is really only making a fool of God and of ourselves. Among the geese there were, however, some individuals which seemed suffering, who grew thin. And about them it was currently said among the geese, there you see what it leads to when flying is taken seriously. For because their hearts are occupied with the thought of wanting to fly, therefore they become thin. They do not thrive. They do not have the grace of God as we have, who therefore become plump and delicate. And so the next Sunday they went again to divine worship, and the old gander preached about the high goal, the Creator. And here again the geese curtsied and the ganders bowed their heads. Had set before the geese whereto the wings were designed. So with the divine worship of Christendom, humans also have wings. They have imagination. Now that's what Kierkegaard does not see in church or in his neighborhood. He sees people seeking some kind of passionless, rationalistic truth and not being able to ask the questions about themselves, making their choices. There is a very radical version of making yourself with your choices that comes in the 20th century. A French theologian, Jean-Paul Sartre, which is one of the things that leads me to think of Kierkegaard's individualism as kind of moving toward the ultimate expression of modern individualism in somebody like Sartre. Sartre's account goes something like this. Now, Sartre lived in Paris. He became, as a result of some of his early writings, very popular among radical thinkers and writers around the world. All the pictures of him sitting in the West Bank coffee shops there where he did much of his writing and much of his listening were prominent in those days. One of Sartre's stories went like this, and one imagines it had its roots in reality. When the Nazis occupied France, the French government made some agreements with them. But some of the French people did not fall in line with that. They formed a resistance, an underground resistance to resist the Nazi presence. Sartre supported that. It's not clear that he was terribly active in it, but he did support it, as did many others. And so he tells the story. One day a young man comes to him and asks him this. He said, I'm trying to decide, should I join the French resistance and fight against these evil Nazis who are trying to take over our country? Or should I take care of my mother? She's old, she needs my help. How do I make a choice like that? And then Sartre says, when people ask questions like that, they're hoping that you've got the answer book with all the objective answers. And his response was always, there is no answer book. Those are your questions, and you've got to choose. And when you make those choices, you make yourself. And then he follows it with even stronger language. You are condemned in this world to be free, to have to make those choices freely. And in that sense, there are no excuses. You can't blame it on external circumstances. You can't blame it on human nature. You can't blame it on the accidents of your birth. Every choice you face as a free person. There is no clear set of right answers in any objective sense. You're going to have to make those choices, put those answers into action in your own life, and then learn to live with it. And when you do that, you will construct yourself. You'll construct yourself as the one who cared more for his mother than for the fate of his country and went home and loved her and took care of her. or you'll construct yourself as the one who really did feel most deeply this passion for keeping the Nazis out and trying to protect French freedom, and the one who put his life on the line out there somewhere to do that. And how do you say one of those is right and the other is wrong in general, Sartre will say. Now, one difference here is that Sartre in the 20th century is a famous atheist, and so one of the things he dismisses right out of the religious answers, Kierkegaard is a very famous Christian, and he keeps looking back into scripture and theology, trying to find guidelines for the decisions we make. And so one sees in those two people almost the two extremes which existentialism covers. If you read anything at all by Sartre, you might have read his play, No Exit. I don't see any signs of recognition there, but it's a play about three people who wind up in hell. And hell, it turns out for them, is a room with 3 sofas and a few other decorative things, and they're stuck there with each other for eternity, out of which comes one of his most often quoted lines, hell is other people. And these 3 people stuck in a hell with 2 people they cannot imagine abiding with for all of eternity, in fact, are there in that way. It's a very clever play, as are many of his plays. But there's also a funny point at which the door opens and it looks for a moment like maybe they can leave. And suddenly, like the geese in Kierkegaard's parable, they don't go out the door. And we're not real sure why, because Sartre doesn't try to give us as much there of an explanation as Kierkegaard does about his geese. What worried Kierkegaard and what worries other existentialists is that this world is marked not by people who focus on freedom, but by people who instead are more concerned to focus on conformity. In the 20th century, one of the models for that was all the Nazis in their brown shirts. A centralized moral authority, centrally enforced, centralized standards about how you must think about other people, and the way to live your life was to fit in to this fascist-style regime. That's the sort of thing that represents the worries of existentialists, and sort of the opposite of their sense of individuals seizing on freedom, making their own decisions, and making their own lives. Now, there's one theme I mentioned a minute ago that remains controversial throughout. Some of you are probably majoring in one of the so-called social sciences. You know, we've got in one building over there, biology, chemistry, physics, and such. And then closer over here, we've got psychology and sociology and economics, disciplines that largely developed in the 19th century through the work of some extraordinary people and continued to develop during the 20th century, but about which a good many people argue. Is it real science? Is it science in the same way that physics and chemistry and biology are? Or is it perhaps less dependable? And the debate still rages on. And I think most social scientists will admit that they are still more in the formative stages than something like, say, chemistry or physics. Chemistry and physics are still changing, still discovering new things, still generating, but they are a little more dependable on many things than the sorts of things that come out of social science. You hear the doubt about social sciences in people like the existentialists. Most clearly in what I said a while ago about Sartre, who says there is no human nature as such. There's your nature and your nature and your nature, and you have made that with your choices. Human nature to fall back on would be a kind of excuse, Sartre would say. Another excuse to be eliminated. It's just you and your freedom and your decisions. There is another really significant presentation of his views on this that we're going to look at in the next class. Is really extraordinary work, Either Or. which suggests the choices, that you cannot in life avoid choosing this or that. And he tells us about several different ways of choosing. He tells us about the aesthete, who is seeking pleasure, and about the ethicist, or the ethical person, who is seeking the objective moral standard, perhaps of the sort that Kant and his like would provide us with. And he tells us about the religious person. And that's where he gets to come back to people like Abraham and talk about what it means to be religious and to make one's choice in that kind of setting. So that's what we'll look at then in the next class. Thank you.